Hello there, my friend. It's the Range Runnin', and I appreciate you stopping by to partake in this chapter of the Range Runnin' Chronicles Pistol Series. If you have watched my review of the Glock G23G4 model, then you know that, according to Glock, it is a law enforcement-only model. Today, I am making a comparison between the G23G4 and the G23G5, just to see what differences exist between the two. So stay with me as I tell you all about them. The major negative of Glock pistols is that the factory ships them with polymer sights. The sights on the Generation 5 versions, according to Glock, have been improved. Glock Gen 5 pistols are now shipping with Ameriglow Glock Spartan Operator Night sights. With that stated, my version came with stock polymer sights that were changed out at the point of purchase. More on that later. The front end of the slide of the Glock Gen 5 is now rounded off. This, while partially for aesthetic reasons, also makes it easier to insert the pistol into a holster. Gen 5 pistols began incorporating an ambidextrous slide stop to make it easier to release the slide with either hand. The ambidextrous slide stop, while adding slightly to the overall width of the pistol, is very minimal and unobtrusive. Glock designed the Gen 5 to make it easier to reload. It features a reversible magazine release button to work with both right-handed and left-handed shooters. Glock also beveled and flared the magazine well to make it easier to strip out an empty magazine and load in a fresh one. Also, Glock has extended the floor plate on the magazines of the Gen 5 and given them an orange follower, making it easier for the operator to tell that the gun is empty or loaded, with the slide locked back and a magazine inserted. Previously, Glock finished their pistols with a tenifer finish, which is extremely wear, rust, and corrosion resistant against moisture and water. Glock made an improvement by now finishing all of their pistols with a NDLC, or nitride diamond-like coating finish. It is designed to be even more weather and corrosion resistant than the tenifer finish. Glock Gen 5 pistols come installed with the GMB, or Glock Marksman barrel. According to Glock, this barrel has improved rifling, which leads to greater accuracy. Also according to Glock, the GMB has better tolerances and case support than the previous Glock factory barrels. Glock's response to numerous complaints from consumers regarding the grip finger grooves was to simply remove them. I never had an issue with the spacing of the previous model's finger grooves. I can miss what I am shooting at, regardless if the pistol grip is with or without finger grooves. Beginning with the Gen 4 Glock's interchangeable backstraps carried forward with the Gen 5. I'll get more into the grip later. The dual recoil spring system, originally featured on the Gen 4 models, was carried forward to the Gen 5. Glock removed the locking block pin of the Gen 4, instead replacing it with a 2-pin system that was previous in the Gen 1, 2, and 3. The reason for the switchback to the old style was because there would be fewer moving parts in the gun, and thus lesser chances of failure, even if it was only minimal. Last, and also carried over from the Gen 4 models, is the slide-release lever coil spring, rather than a flat spring. While this may have been intended as an improvement, I would have rather seen a hair-wider slide-release lever. I don't think that I'm alone in that thinking, although such can be purchased from third-party vendors. next thing to look at are the specifications of each. Then I will dig into the features of both, somewhat side by side. While the G23 Gen 4 and Gen 5 share many common traits, there are some differences between the two because of the generations. So, let's take a look at those differences, or sameness, if it applies. The front end of the slide of the Gen 5 is more rounded off than is the Gen 4, or previous versions. I will say that the front end of the Gen 5 is more appealing to the eye in removing some of that blocky Glock look. It would seem that the rounded muzzle end would help in holstering the pistol, but I have yet to prove that. My concern is how fast I can unholster the firearm, rather than how fast I can holster it. The sights that came with the Gen 4 are night sights, and may have been requested by the agency that ordered this pistol, as this is a law enforcement-only version. The front sight is adequate, while the rear sight is very hard to see with my old eyes. The sights on the Generation 5 were standard Glock polymer sights, but were changed to TrueGlow TFX Pro glowing tritium and fiber optic extreme night sights, sights that I can actually see in daylight or low-light conditions. The sights on the Gen 4 will also be replaced with the TrueGlow TFX Pro sights. The ambidextrous slide stop of the Gen 5 does add slightly to the overall width of the pistol, as compared to the Gen 4. The ambidextrous slide stop, however, does afford me the capability to release the slide using the thumb or trigger finger, in addition to using the slingshot method. Whatever works at the time, I always say. The move to using an ambidextrous slide lock by Glock was a good one, in my opinion. The Gen 5 allows the use of earlier magazines. The Gen 5's magazine orange follower separates it from earlier versions. Glock also beveled and flared the magazine well more on the Gen 5 over the Gen 4 to make it easier for loading and to strip out a magazine, if needed. The difference in slide finishes can be readily seen between the Gen 4 and Gen 5. The finish of the Gen 4 is more flat-looking, compared to the NDLC finish of the Gen 5, which exhibits more contrast between the slide and frame. Both finishes, however, will outlast me and my uses for these pistols. Glock Gen 5 pistols come installed with the GMB, or Glock Marksman barrel. The Gen 4 has the standard Glock barrel. While subtle to the eye, the differences with each barrel's lands can be seen if looked at closely. Does the GMB make a difference? Range results may demonstrate so if it does. However, I believe that it is up to the shooter to make a gun accurate, but a good barrel sure does help. The Gen 4, of course, has finger grooves on the grip, whereas the Gen 5 does not. Finger grooves can help with aligning the hand to the grip, and also provide a hook point when drawing the firearm from a holster. With regard to finger grooves or no finger grooves, I have no preference of one over the other. As I mentioned, I can miss what I am aiming at, regardless if the pistol grip is with or without finger grooves. Both the Gen 4 and Gen 5 came with grip adapters. The Gen 4 came with both beaver tail and non-beaver tail adapters, 2 of each. The Gen 5 came with only beaver tail adapters, 2 of each. The thickest of the beaver tail adapters were installed on both pistols, therefore giving both the Gen 4 and Gen 5 the same feel in the hand. Both the Gen 4 and Gen 5 incorporate the dual recoil spring system. Glock removed the locking block pin of the Gen 4, instead replacing it with a 2-pin system, as with the Gen 5. This is an interesting throwback to pre-Gen 4 versions that incorporated 3 pins. I have seen the Glock frames crack at the locking block pinhole. Whether the cracking was due to running hot ammunition, shooting many rounds, or something else, I don't know. But the removal of the locking block pin adds strength to the frame, since the locking block pin hole was very close to the top of the frame and, therefore, was a stress point. The slide release lever coil spring was carried over from the Gen 4. The coil spring and the design of the slide release lever does make it easier to remove the slide release lever from the frame over the older flat spring design. With that said, a bit wider slide release lever would make disassembly easier overall. The last difference worth mentioning is the trigger pull weight. The Gen 5 trigger pull is rated at 5.84 pounds, while the Gen 4 trigger pull is rated at 6.29 pounds. The measured trigger pull weight with a 5-pull average of the Gen 4 trigger is 2 pounds 3.8 ounces, whereas measured trigger pull weight of the Gen 5 trigger was 3 pounds 3.1 ounces. The Gen 4 that I have was used, and I imagine that the trigger was pulled on numerous occasions, thus resulting in a lower trigger pull weight over the Gen 5, that is a new pistol. Will the Gen 5 trigger pull weight decrease after use as parts wear in? I don't know, but I suspect that it will. I will say that the Gen 5 trigger, although heavier than that of the Gen 4, felt smoother in its operation. Thus, the feeling of the trigger was less than expected. Regardless, both triggers did their jobs, as you will see during the range time. Now that I have covered the differences and sameness between the Gen 4 and Gen 5 G23 that I have, let's see if there are any differences at the range. At the range would be a good place to talk about recoil. 40 Smith & Wesson generates, on average, 6.3 foot-pounds of felt recoil, 50% more than the 9mm 4.5 foot-pounds. By comparison, that is all not that high when compared with other cartridges, like the .357 Magnum, that will impart about 9 pounds of slam into the hand, which is double that of the 9mm. While recoil is not a deal breaker to me, you should be aware that a .40 Smith & Wesson will recoil more than a 9mm, all things being equal. As Glock puts it, the G23 Gen4 puts controllable power into an ideally sized package. Controllable power, such an interesting term. I believe it is more who controls the power that makes it controllable. After all, many agencies return to the 9mm because some officers and agents could not control the power generated by the .40 Smith & Wesson, and who were far more satisfied with shooting the 9mm. Granted that the .40 Smith & Wesson is snappier on recoil than the 9mm, regardless of the bullet weight. Snappy is subjective to the beholder, person who be holding the pistol. To me, the snappiness of the .40 Smith & Wesson feels better to me than the mild snappy of the 9mm, because I feel that I am working with something that is more powerful than the 9mm, without the abuse of a larger caliber fired in the same size pistol, like the .45 ACP fired through a G30 or a lightweight 1911. As I get older, I am becoming more sensitive to these types of things. Now, I am far from being a ballistics expert, but I do know what I feel when putting rounds through a firearm. .40 Smith & Wesson round just feels good to me. With that said, the .40 Smith & Wesson cartridge enjoyed 2.5 decades of field use, developing a nice little following in the process. In 2014, however, the FBI announced that they were returning to the 9mm, thanks to better technology and ballistics. The .40 Smith & Wesson is a powerful cartridge that offers deep penetration and good expansion. The downside is that the cartridge does pack recoil that can affect how quickly follow-up shots can be taken. While not separated by a world of difference, the 9mm and .40 Smith & Wesson have their respective strengths and weaknesses, which makes them advantageous for different scenarios. The 9mm offers lighter recoil, a higher capacity magazine, a lower cost per round, and with reasonable threat-stopping capability. A .40 Smith & Wesson gives you more power up front and more threat-stopping capability, but at the cost of capacity. I am, however, willing to give up a round or two if the cartridge does its job well in stopping a threat. And to add yet another perspective to things, I would rather fire a .40 Smith & Wesson out of the G23 than I would firing 10mm out of a G29. If I need a 10mm Glock, it would be a G20 or G40, both of which are too big to carry concealed on a daily basis, and are better suited to environments where very large furry animals want to eat you for lunch. I believe the G23 to be ideal when I am out and about among the English, and not doing stupid things with stupid people at stupid places. Having shot the G23 Gen4 and also the G22 Gen5, I knew what to expect from the G23 Gen5, exceptional performance, and I would be disappointed if that did not happen. Today, I am using up some 40 Smith Wesson 180 grain range ammunition, and also some 180 grain JHP ammunition for defensive load evaluation. I'll let you know what I am using when during the range session. This is the first day at the range with the G23 Gen5, so let's see if I can make the G23 walk the walk. There is no need to go into a full maintenance montage, as disassembly of a Glock is well documented and for the most part well known. If you own a Glock, refer to the manual for general and specific maintenance operations. If you don't own a Glock, but are curious, I invite you to go to the Glock Downloadable Materials site, where you can view and download a plethora of publications. For me, concealing the Glock G23 is not an issue. One of my more favorite holsters is the Gelco Classic Light 2.0 that can house a variety of Glock pistols due to its flexible nature, including the G23 in all generations and the G30. In addition, the G23 also fits well in my Felco A112 Hawk holster for the G19, although the fit is a bit tighter due to the wider slide width. Sliding right into my Felco rotor shoulder holster system, the G23 is also at home as a vertical shoulder holster carry. My Alien Gear Cloak Tuck 3.5 can also be put into service of housing the G23 when I want cross-draw carry to be the order of the day. The G23 Gen 4 and Gen 5 are both very capable pistols to protect the self and the homestead. The G23 Gen 4, a law enforcement-only pistol, was, no doubt, a police trade-in. Slightly used but not abused. The disconnector did need to be replaced, but that was the extent needed to make it safe and serviceable. The installed night sights, for me, will need to be replaced, and I will probably opt for the TrueGlow TFX Pro, glowing tritium and fiber optic extreme night sights as a replacement, the same sight that was installed on my G23 Gen 5. The G23 Gen 5 has some, no doubt, improvements over the Gen 4. 3 improvements were the most noticeable: the improved trigger, the ambidextrous slide lock release, and the grip adapter. The trigger of the Gen 5, although slightly heavier than that of the Gen 4, was the better of the two. The ambidextrous slide lock provides an additional means of releasing the slide should my left hand be busy or incapacitated. The grip adapter allowed me to make the grip fit my hand better over the Gen 4, although the Gen 4 does have finger grooves that I do happen to like. But as I've stated before, I can work with both finger grooves and no finger grooves. Accuracy leaned more toward the Gen 5, as I seemed to shoot it better. But then again, these pistols were shot on different days, and only shooting them side by side on the same day would better tell the story. I did find, however, that perceived felt recoil and muzzle flip was reduced with the Gen 5. There again, shooting them side by side on the same day may tell a different story, or not. The Gen 5 is destined for a primary carry firearm, while the Gen 4 will be designated as a backup to it. In other words, both are keepers. If one is seriously considering the .40 Smith Wesson cartridge, and are looking for a serious handgun to carry and shoot them through, the Glock G23 just might be the call for duty. For now, the G23 Gen 5 is heading to the holster, while the Gen 4 is heading to the safe. Well, my friends, this chapter is at its end. I hope that you found it enlightening, at least to the difference between the G23 Gen 4 and G23 Gen 5. I could say that the difference between the Gen 5 version and earlier version of Glock pistols would probably follow suit. I not only experienced the difference with the G23, but also the G20 in 10mm. but that's for another time. Until we meet again, and I do hope that you will return to the channel, be vigilant, be armed, and be safe out there.